Good morning, everybody. This is Michael Farnham, CTO with Set Solutions. You are on our Tech Thursday. We appreciate you joining. Just some insight into Tech Thursday. This is kind of an inside view of how we do things here at Set Solutions, how we stay up to date with our partners and get the latest from them from a technical standpoint. So we've put this out for our customers to get a look at this as well, kind of give us that inside view of how we do things. So we appreciate you joining. Today, we are going to have Varonis with us, as you can see by the display. Varonis, we got Matt Radlick from over there. He's going to be doing a live demo in Attack Lab. So you can get some good insight into how Varonis does things. We will be accepting questions via the chat feature. So if you have any questions during the session, please ask them in chat. And we generally answer those at the end, but if there's something really compelling and interesting that somebody asks, we will interrupt, and Matt is completely okay with doing that. Also at the end, just a little bit of housekeeping. There will be a survey going out after this is over, and if you answer that, you'll be entered into a raffle to get a pair of AirPods from Varonis. So please be sure to answer that. We'll be recording the session as well and putting that up later for anybody who didn't attend. So unless there's anything else, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So Matt, if you want to take over.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the eloquent introduction, and for everyone out there listening, thanks for attending today. Look forward to going through a few things with you guys. So let's dive right in. First thing I want to do is make sure that everybody understands just a little bit of information about Varonis. So I'll go over a little bit of a high-level overview of where Varonis fits in the security ecosystem and how we help organizations. I'm going to deep dive into one part of our platform, our analytics portion. And then we're going to get into the really why you guys are all here. My guess is I'm going to go through a simulated attack on Office 365 where I'll bypass multi-factor authentication and kind of move laterally and kind of spread my my attacker mindset all throughout an organization. And I'll walk you guys through that every step of the way. And again, I just want to echo, I love doing these webinars. I have an opportunity to do them fairly frequently. One of my favorite things is at the end when I read over all the questions that I got about either the presentation, the material I covered, or about Varonis's technology. So if you're one of those people that loves to dive in and interact with the presenter a little bit, today is your day. I can't wait to chat with you and answer your questions as we move through. So thank you guys again. Let's talk about Varonis. So when you're thinking about Varonis, I want you guys to think about data security. I want you to think about the importance of monitoring your critical data and pieces of your infrastructure. Things like your Windows file servers and application servers, your Office 365 environment, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, Azure Active Directory, and Microsoft Teams. Things like your SharePoint and Exchange on-prem, your NAS arrays, your NetApps, your Isilons, all these big storage appliances that everybody has. Things like Microsoft Teams. Right? I'm sure a lot of you are actively leveraging Teams. Varonis is a big user of Teams. Things like your VPN, DNS, and web proxy, as well as your Active Directory. And what we aim to do is really answer a lot of core questions for organizations. We want to help them understand if their data is at risk. What we mean by that is, where is the data that's the most important to you? We call that sensitive data, like regulated data types, or maybe where your intellectual property is. Can you identify where it's located, who has access to it, and whether or not it's exposed, meaning that maybe someone's misusing it or abusing it, or maybe there's just too many people that have access to it. And then actually empowering organizations to take change against those risks. So how do I actually implement that least privilege model that I've always wanted without actually risking, impact to the business or to end users? And I'll walk you guys through a little bit about how we do that today. One of the other things I want to focus on is, how do you monitor your data and your critical infrastructure to identify the misuse and abuse of your data infrastructure? How do you identify when, personal information might have been breached, giving you a duty to report it? How do you understand how people are connecting in remotely now that we're all working from home or attending webinars from home and accessing information, whether on-prem or in the cloud? How do you identify sophisticated or zero-day threats? Like, one of the things I'm going to walk through right now in a few minutes, this Office 365 man in the middle bypass, it's still something that hasn't been patched. I wouldn't call it a zero-day threat anymore because a man in the middle attack's been around for a long time, but it's something that just fundamentally takes advantages of features of multi-factor authentication. And I'll talk to you guys about that in a couple minutes. And organizations care about these things a lot. Like, they care about protecting their data. They care about identifying and stopping threats on their data because they have compliance concerns, whether that's like, CCPA, GDPR, PCI, SOX, HIPAA. There's so many different regulations that organizations are concerned about that apply restrictions or needs around protecting information. And the way that we bring that to life is really by kind of weighing like the current state of affairs with our platform. And one of the things that we see in the marketplace right now is again, this is probably stating the obvious, but everybody has gone from, I'm kind of thinking about moving to Office 365 to everybody's working from home and we are all over Office 365. One of the other things that we saw, March, April timeframe was that, the number one thing was connectivity and business continuity. And for some organizations, that meant security was taking a back seat. The other thing that we've seen alongside that, and something I'm going to go into more details about in a couple minutes, is that attackers are taking advantage of this situation. So like in one instance, when you think about just one very particular type of exposure, we've seen a lot of organizations allow remote desktop to be exposed to the internet, a lot of times unknowingly, where they've deployed some new application or service and they didn't realize that RDP was open any to any on that box. And Shodan, which is like Google for red teamers or hackers, it is definitely something that is probably blocked from your corporate computer, so you might have to go to your phone to get to it. But I always encourage people to check it out. They are who identified this big surge in remote desktop being open up to the internet. In addition to that, what we see at Varonis, so in my role at Varonis, I run our security architecture and incident response division. So I have quite a broad focus on helping customers with their operational and strategic security needs. One of those things is helping them respond to threats. And we've seen a shift in the types of attacks that we help our customers thwart. Specifically, we've seen a real rise in brute force attacks. I think this is something that is also being called out by law enforcement agencies around the world. There's just a lot more, remote work or Office 365 or even on-prem portals like a RDP computer open to the internet that's accessible by anyone, and attackers are using these, credential libraries in order to take advantage of that. We've also seen a really big surge in insider threats. There's one specific category of insiders I want to talk with you guys about, and that's what I call an inside outer. So in the past, a lot of people thought of insider threats. They thought of things like, okay, I've got this, IT administrator who's gone rogue, kind of like an Edward Snowden-like example, but they didn't necessarily think about things like, that person who just has access to stuff and is worried about losing their job and is starting to amass that information and take it out. And we're seeing a humongous amount of events and investigations that we do that are all into that type of activity, where it's a person who, has legitimate access to data, but is amassing that. And I guess the last category, not to get into, because I could talk to you guys all day long about the different incidents that we thwart from an IR standpoint. The last category I want to talk with you about is ransomware. Now, ransomware has been around for a long time, but the thing that's changed in 2020 is that ransomware used to be just a initial infection vector, where we would see an organization get hit with a ransomware attack, and then proceeding on from that ransomware attack, they would, maybe they would block it, maybe they would stop it, maybe they would pay the ransom. But by and large, that was the only part of that particular attack. The shift that we've seen is ransomware has now become a late stage part of an attack. So rather than something that's deployed early on, attackers are waiting until they have things like domain administrative credentials, or they're able to embed the ransomware in the logon script before they unleash the ransomware. In addition to that, they've also started to also exfiltrate the data, so that if you're an organization that feels well equipped to handle a ransomware infection, like maybe you have great backups, what you're at risk for is then having to pay the ransom so that that data doesn't get posted online. And that represents a kind of a fundamental shift in how cyber criminals and threat actor groups are approaching ransomware. And again, these are just some of the trends that I want to share with you guys, in addition to the fact that in terms of working with Varonis, our IR team is a part of your subscription to Varonis. So you've got access to a worldwide group of security resources ranging in skill sets from, incident triage and analysis to, malware forensics, endpoint forensics, network forensics, malware research, security operations specialists, even people like myself that get involved in nearly every single incident that we see. Again, that's all just a kind of a part of the Varonis customer experience. And that's really what leads to our ability to do these types of webinars. So the attack scenario that I'm going to walk you through after I give you guys a little bit more of a deep dive into how our analytics works is actually going to be one that we've seen in the wild that we liked so much. We really thought it would be a great tool to then teach people about the actual steps that an attacker takes. And I think the reason why that's important is because in the current state of affairs, these attacks are largely more successful. Organizations are, the success rate, I would say in the past might have been 5 or 10%. We're seeing that as nearly double, where the average organization is not able to actively block or thwart all these new types of threats. And people are pretty stressed out. A lot of our customers are, they're at capacity, or they've had some furloughs and they have a reduced working capacity and they need to take action in order to reduce that, or, they feel like they're overwhelmed. And that's really where I really want to make sure that you guys know that from a Varonis standpoint, we want to apply analytics and automation on all those different data stores that I told you that we care about in order to implement 3 primary use cases. One of them being around protecting your data. So how do I actually implement that least privilege model? One around privacy and compliance. So being able to use all these different security controls that you're going to hear me talk about in the platform, or specifically some of the monitoring controls we're going to focus on today. And then threat detection and response, which really is the focus of today's webinar. I want to make sure that you guys understand fully what Varonis does from a threat detection and response standpoint. And that's what I'm going to get into next. So when you're thinking about security event analytics as like a category, ways and places that I can send security logs to in order to receive alerts about things that might be happening in my environment, Varonis is definitely a player in that space, and we've got a really great technology. What we do is collect events from all these critical data stores and your infrastructure in order to process them and learn things about the entities inside of your environment. And we can do that without being on all of your endpoints. So if you're thinking, oh great, another endpoint agent, that is not what you're hearing about today. Varonis is able to perform its analytics without having to get installed on every machine inside of your environment. And what makes us special and unique, what I always like to talk about, is what we call enrichment. And what I mean by that is adding data to the data that you collect. So if you think about a raw file system event, like the one that I'm presenting from right now, you've got very basic information. And if I asked anyone on the phone to tell me if this was okay, they would probably answer that with, well, can I ask you some questions first? Who is that user? What kind of data is in that file? Is that path a protected share? Or what about that IP address? Is that IP address that person's normal IP? Is it a subnet that I care about? There's just a lot of questions that an analyst is left with when they look at a raw log. And what Varonis aims to do before we even process these events into a machine learning algorithm to alert on anomalies or other events of interest is add data to the data that we collect. And this is what we call enrichment. This is why Varonis would be classified as a semi-supervised machine learning platform for any data scientist that might be attending the call today. So we want to do things like identify the account types: admin accounts, executive accounts, service accounts, and regular users. In addition to that, because we're doing file level analysis and going in and classifying all these files that exist in all these different data repositories, whether it's like a Windows file server or SharePoint or it's Office 365, we know the contents of the file. So we know the difference between a file open event on a spreadsheet that contains nothing of interest and one that contains sensitive information like 100 credit card numbers. At the moment of event collection, if we only see an IP address in the native log, we're actually going to resolve the IP address to a host name. So we're going to know information like the fact that which computer had this IP at the time that that event was collected. If it's an external IP, like an Office 365 logon event or a VPN authentication session, we're also going to know the geolocation that originated from, and all of that we consider a precursor for learning what's normal. So we'll use this behavioral analytics to identify and learn normal behavior. And that's what allows us to then alert on things that deviate from what's normal. So some of the threat models that I'll talk about on how we catch this Office 365 man-in-the-middle attack are based on a normal behavior detection, while some of our models are looking at things that detect cyber threats. So how do we know that? Well, we know the computers that a person normally works from, we know the IP they connect from, we know the device that they both authenticate from and access data from, and we know things about that, where they work and what type of information that they work on. And all of that goes into our learning so that we can alert you and tell you about things that are of interest. Things like when someone accesses an unusual amount of sensitive information. Things like when a person logs on or accesses data from a computer that they don't normally, or maybe when they log on and access data, or maybe they're accessing information at an atypical time. And that really is what I will aim to kind of get you guys educated on before we dive into a specific attack. Because when you think about the world of cyber attacks, there's probably, hundreds of thousands or even millions of ways that attackers can get into an organization and move around and amass information and exfiltrate data. And I'm only going to show you the lens into a handful of attacker techniques now. So what we're going to do is actually go through a multi-factor authentication bypass in Office 365. So we're going to use a phishing email to get a person to visit a website that looks like a legitimate Office 365 logon page. Now, for some of you security savvy users on the webinar, you're going to know right away that it's not that page, but I want you to think of every person in your organization or your family members and colleagues that would 100% fall for it. From there, we're going to upload an Office file that contains some malicious code. In this case, we're going to use an Office macro to Office 365, and then we're going to invite people to collaborate on that. And what that's going to do is allow us to move laterally from our initial infection into this one user account with this one token inside of Office 365 to many, many other computers that access that link that we share with them. From there, the malware will then be installed on their computer, giving us a command and control or the ability to take actions on behalf of those users. We'll use all these new infected hosts to access information, and then we'll just email it to ourselves. And one of the things I always kind of get asked on these webinars that I'll answer ahead of time for you guys is, do attackers really just email data to themselves? And yes, the answer is, from my experience, both previous to Varonis, leading other kinds of cybersecurity or investigative teams, as well as leading the IR team at Varonis, is that attackers are generally lazy and take the path of least resistance. So if you allow them to email things to themselves, that is probably how they will take that data out. But if you don't, maybe they'll leverage a technique like DNS tunneling, where they break that file up into thousands and thousands of little pieces and sneak them out one DNS query at a time. So there's certainly all sorts of types of data exfiltration that you should be concerned about. So let's get an idea of what this scenario actually looked like, right? Now, this is just an example of a phishing email where, hey, hey, this user, I need you to click on this link to gain access to this document. So it looks like an invitation to collaborate or to access information. From there, once that user is then going to click on that link, what will happen is they'll be presented with that fraudulent logon page. That's where we're going to get them to type in their credentials. And the reason I'm kind of showing you guys this with more of a diagram before I show you how the attack actually looks is because it's kind of easy to miss out on some of the nuances, right? So once they do that, right, I'm running that web server that phishing page is being hosted on. So when that user types in their username and password, I'm going to be capturing that and simultaneously replaying it to Office 365. And it's the fact that I simultaneously replay that on a legitimate authentication portal from my attacker machine that's going to allow me to push that user to Office 365 afterwards. So once they go to my logon page, once they type in their valid username and password, they're then going to get access to Office 365 to the very document that I intended on sharing with them. And that's going to be what makes this attack so successful. So that person will get that 2FA push from Office 365. They'll type in that code, still happening on my fraudulent attacker web server. And then when they get that valid authentication token, that's when we're going to send it back to their computer. So let's kind of walk through what that actually looks like, right? You'll see that their user is on a web page, and if you look at the URL, that's really the only thing that makes it look and appear as not a legitimate authentication portal. Otherwise, this is very much what it looks like in order to log on to Office 365. You'll see that I was able to pass through that two-factor authentication request, tricking that user into actually logging in and approving that authentication, whether they're using Microsoft Authenticator or they're getting like a text message with a code inside of it. And they could even select that they want to continuously stay logged in here or have additional ways in order to retain access into this environment. In addition to that, now we're actually getting our initial foothold. So they got logged in. Now they have access to the document that I wanted to share with them. But what's happening from the attacker standpoint is now I also have access to their entire Office 365 identity. So I can get at all sorts of information. And the reason that I was able to do that is I was able to capture and replay what's called a session token. This is also like could commonly be referred to as like a cookie. Now, granted, it is a little bit more sophisticated than that. This is an encrypted authentication token that I'm going to then replay by injecting it into my browser. But that string of text or code that you see, it's really just a string of hexadecimal encoded characters. That represents my authentication token. And that is all that you need once you've successfully gotten access to Office 365 to replay that authentication on another computer. And that's what we're going to do next. So we're going to just copy pasta this cookie into our browser that we captured from our attacker web server. And that's going to allow us to log in and impersonate that user on Office 365. And this is the part that I was kind of mentioning in the beginning of the webinar. This is a feature, right? This is how Office 365 works by design in order to enable a really robust single sign-on user experience. And that's what we're taking advantage of. That's what this attacker is taking advantage of. So they're going to go to outlook.com. They are going to then, now that we have this cookie in this browser, be able to log on and impersonate this user. And that's what it looks like. Here is that email that I had actually emailed to them that they opened up from their device that led them to my fraudulent logon page. They're just now looking at it inside of office.com. This is where I'm going to, as an attacker, move from the initial infection vector into the lateral movement phase of the attack. So what I want to do is share content with other people in my organization. Now, if I looked at your recent contacts, if I compromised your email account, that's probably the people I would choose first. So I would want to be able to take that, stolen information, and I don't want to try to trick you into opening a document. And if I chose people that I collaborate with often, and since it's going to come from my legitimate account, that's going to mean that there's a high risk of you opening that document that I share with you. So maybe it's like, a classic example would be like a macro enabled Word document that once you click on enable content, maybe that's the dropper from my initial infection vector where I'm then going to be able to, get command and control access to your machine. And what I'm showing you inside of my lab environment right now is what that looks like inside of Kali Linux, which is a pretty popular flavor of Linux for attackers. Specifically on there, I'm running the Metasploit framework and I'm using Meterpreter for command and control. This is probably the most common command and control tool, very open source. You can learn about how to use it on YouTube. And there's a lot of content and videos on it. And so, of course, that's what I'm using here inside of this lab environment. In addition to that, right, once I get access to a user, I have their username and password, I'm able to, maybe crack one of their passwords, or I'm able to pick it up off the wire because I have administrative access on their machine. I can then impersonate those users to access data that I didn't normally have access to. And ultimately, that's what attackers want to do. They want to search for and amass information on files and folders that may be related to their initial objectives. Now, this is what really varies, and you guys probably know better than I do the types of threats or what data is important to you and your organization. Could be financial information, could be design materials, could be customer data. Maybe customer data is most important to you. And ultimately, that's the data that you need to try to protect because that's what keeps your brand alive or keeps your reputation alive. And that's the kind of thing that an attacker also is going to be able to easily find out. I bet after spending 5 minutes on any one of the attendees on this webinar's company's webpage, I'd be able to figure out what types of data might be valuable that's living inside of your different data stores. And that would be what I would target if I was the attacker charged with breaking into your environment and stealing information. In my example, I'm going after quarterly financial reports, maybe because I want to gain the stock market. From there, I'm going to put them into a password protected zip archive. Now, this is just one of the first times I want to ask the audience a question, so feel free, anybody in the chat, to chime in here with why would an attacker put the documents they want to exfiltrate into a password protected zip archive? And anybody, I'm going to check on the chat window real quick. Anybody can chime in with why they think they would do that. And if you guys don't have any takers, I'm going to wait like a minute or so
Very
but
good.
I'm definitely interested in hearing what you're saying. Yeah, we've got two so far. To bypass DLP or protections, that is exactly right. When you password protect a zip file, you are encrypting it. And when you encrypt it, you are making it nearly impossible to be intercepted. And this is what's called obfuscation. So that's an attack technique, or a TTP, a tactic, technique, and protocol of attackers that know what they're doing, right? Or of insiders that know that that's the way that they can get stuff out through your DLP, people that have this material knowledge already. So great job, guys. If I had gold stars I could give out, I would give you both a gold star. You guys definitely nailed that one on the head. So now let's kind of talk through, well, what happens next, right? Now, I'm on these machines. I've sent it out to my friends. What do I want to do next? One of the things that we're seeing really commonly is executive email compromise. Execs, these days have a lot of tough decisions on their mind. We actually had one client in your region, believe it or not, where early on in this new world that we all live in, they had to downsize their company. They were left with some tough financial decisions, and a insider's email account was used to access an executive email inbox by having permissions to it. And they were able to identify upcoming furloughs, which they then relayed to most of the workforce. So even though that those layoffs weren't going to happen for several weeks, news got out, and that caused very detrimental damage to that company's day-to-day operations. And that was something that we helped them investigate to kind of identify the root cause and the patient zero. And it's very, very easy for administrators or attackers that gain administrative rights to give themselves access to other people's mailboxes in a nearly invisible way. And once they're able to do that, they're able to take that information and send it anywhere they want. So I told you before, path of least resistance is often to email documents to themselves. And it's definitely something that we see a lot. And this is what it would look like, right? Even with things like Gmail, you actually don't even need to hit the send button in order to exfiltrate the file. All that you need to do is upload it to the drafts folder, and you've been able to exfiltrate that document out. And that can even be something that can even trick some network-based DLPs just due to how they work on that actual HTTP or SSL transaction. And now I want to talk to you about, like, okay, Matt, this is scary. This is incredible. People can bypass multi-factor authentication. I didn't even know that was possible. How can you help me? What can Varonis do for me? Well, other than the fact that we want to help implement like all sorts of different controls on your data, up into and including monitoring. We also want to help with actually managing access and setting you up for success from an infrastructure standpoint. Let's talk about the monitoring part, right? Let's talk about how we want to apply analytics to monitor user behavior and what types of things we would have alerted on. So we would have probably triggered a handful of out-of-the-box threat models. Some of the ones that come to mind for me initially are geolocation-based threat models. So we don't just implement the impossible travel rule, which you'll see we call unreasonable geo-hopping. That's what's related to someone logging in from one place and then logging in from from a standpoint of physics, an impossible place. So like right now, I'm in New York. And if I was to generate a logon event here in New York and 5 minutes later generate a logon event in, let's say, Bangladesh, that would be impossible, right? No one's got a plane that can fly that past. We're not in Star Trek where you can just beam me up and I'll be there, instantaneously. So, that's what we call geo-hopping. But one of the other things that we see a lot is just when an attacker will leverage and access an organization's network from a geolocation that's new to the organization. Right? So they don't necessarily replay. They were able to maybe capture their credentials or guess their credentials from somewhere else. And so that might be a threat model to trigger in this scenario as well, where you see attacker log in from a place that we just learned wasn't a place people normally log in from. One of the other things that we do, because we pull in those proxy events, is get a very good understanding of where files are being downloaded from, particularly what processes are being used to download files and what user agents are being used to download files, and whether or not a particular website may be a known malicious website. And that's what then allows us to identify when users might be downloading those malicious Word documents that might contain those macros. We also baseline how users interact with data. So we'll be able to identify when they access unusual amounts of data that's in unusual places, or even just when they access unusual sensitive data. So because we go in and classify those files, we know how users behave with each and every file and folder inside of your environment. We also understand their web and email activity. So maybe we'll identify when that admin accesses that CEO's mailbox. Maybe we'll identify when someone is performing that upload event onto the web and they upload an unusual amount of information to the web. These are all different ways that we're able to detect this type of attacker behavior, and we aim to give you insights in order to be able to respond to it above and beyond just doing things like, giving you an alert. What we want to do is give you the ability to go from, hey, this thing happened in my Office 365 environment, to these were the actual files that were touched. Because oftentimes in a breach, from my experiences, organizations, especially those of you that are taking this webinar, you partner with Set Solutions, you probably have some security tools in your environment. You probably sat through this and thought, oh, I think I could block or detect a few of those things. And that's good. I'm really glad that that's the case, if that's how you're reacting. But what I want you to think about is, you have an incident like this. How do you answer the question, was sensitive data affected? Do I have a duty to report this incident because this attacker accessed personal information? And that's often where Varonis shines the brightest light for an organization, is helping them get an understanding of how people work with their data and how that fits in with the rest of their infrastructure. Like, are they using that data in order to, exfiltrate it? Are they just using it in support of a particular business use case? And we can do that whether or not your data is in the on-prem environment or it's inside of Office 365. And for organizations that are operating in a hybrid cloud world, I actually just did a webinar on that just last week. We were able to apply everything across both as well. So whether you're in the on-prem or you're in the cloud or you're in some type of hybrid state, this analytics, all the automation that we can provide out of the box is all applicable to you. And the thing I just want to, before I start to answer questions, I just really want to make sure that you guys know, a lot of companies stepping up, doing a lot of things for organizations that have been impacted by these changes, whether financially, whether it be their workforce, whether it be just like, just trying to help, right? Everybody's trying to do their best right now. And Varonis has got a really generous offer. What we're doing is offering extended trial periods of a lot of our different products in order to get a handle around this remote workforce. But the really big value add on top of that, and I'm biased, right? I lead our IR team, is we're also pairing all of these evaluations with a security expert from the IR team to do proactive threat hunting. We don't just want to demonstrate the power of our software to you. We actually want to review the data with you and get a very good understanding of whether or not we're identifying any current attacks, whether or not we're identifying any misuse or abuse of your data by an insider, but also painting a picture of risk. Where do you have sensitive information that's overexposed that Varonis can help you lock down? And that's something that we partner with Set Solutions on. So if that's something that's of interest to you, it really is the best way to see, how can I even get even a slice of the picture that Matt was demonstrating today as me as your presenter, or how do I get a better understanding on whether or not the monitoring controls that I've applied are sufficient. And from here, I'm going to switch gears over to the Q&A, over to the chat. I'm ready to spend some time talking with you guys about the attack that we just walked through and make sure that I answer any questions that you have. So we've got one around, will there be slides available following the presentation? I'm interested in the sample of the fake authentication page that directs user to prove the MFA and enter their credentials on the fake site. Absolutely, this entire presentation will be available. We will even send out the recording. I do not mind sending out the slides either. This is a demonstration, happy to do that again. Let me check the chat. We got some in the chat, it looks like, as well. Yeah, so what are we seeing as far as industries and companies that are doing things like, taking stances against password protected zip files or email encryption protocols? Yeah, this is really tough. So definitely some organizations leverage the ability to block the creation or the transmission of password protected zip files. That is definitely an option that you have, either using like Windows controls or third-party software. And that's just another roadblock for an attacker trying to take data out. I would also say though that it's really, there's no, and I think of a CISO I used to work with a lot at a previous employer. There's no security nirvana. There is no happy place in the security world. I would want to leave you guys with the kind of resounding sense of, I need to manage risk, right? And there are risks with every single avenue that your company takes from a technology standpoint, and even from a physical security standpoint. So, when you think about email, implementing email encryption, The pros, you're able to ensure the privacy of that information. The cons, you can no longer sniff and read that email. Another one might be like, I need to take actions to protect data, but what if that impacts people? Well, that's where, from a Varonis standpoint, because we don't just want to give you the ability to protect information, the other thing that we want to do is give you the ability to monitor it. When you combine those two things together, that means that we can do and implement changes, but based on the understanding of us knowing who uses that data. So we have an extremely low risk of causing an impact to the business. I think I saw, I haven't seen any other questions come in yet, but I would love to hear more from you guys. And if you don't have questions and you just want to, have any comments, any feedback from me as a presenter, feel free to shoot them off. I am wide open here, guys. I really enjoy, working with different companies, talking with them about these types of threats, developing presentations on it is what gets me out of bed every morning and keeps me excited at work. So keep on rolling, keep on rolling questions, comments, or concerns in.
Great, Matt. Appreciate the time. Thanks for the great presentation. Everybody who joined, we just want to tell you from us, thank you for joining. Thank you for Varonis for putting this together as well. And for anybody, by the way, who did not get if you did not get your gift card, please reach out to Lauren. You'll also be getting Lauren Lynch. You'll be getting an email from her later on today, a follow-up email from her later today. So if you didn't get your gift card, please let her know. Thanks for the questions from everybody. And just a final point again to follow up from earlier, that email you'll have a link in there for a survey. If you fill that out, you will be eligible for the raffle to get the AirPods from Varonis. So, and actually, Matt, we just got one other question. Is the solution equally effective on those that are still running MS Office on premise and not on 365? Did Matt fall off?
I'm muted. That is what happened. Thank you. Kevin, great question. The attack scenario I ran through today was an Office 365 focused attack scenario. I have other ones that I do to simulate attacks on-prem if you're interested in understanding how we help from a cyber threat standpoint. However, I just want to also reiterate, Varonis technology is able to be utilized in different ways. We can work with companies that are 100% on-prem, provide them with the ability to protect their data, test compliance, detect threats. We can do it with companies that are 100% in Office 365 or companies in the hybrid world. It does not matter to us. We are happy to run our assessment and show you how we can do that for you on your own data. I would say that it is equally effective in any one of those scenarios. It's all, when you think about it from a security standpoint, it's all about, well, what do I have to protect and what controls are available from Varonis to protect it.
Great. Thanks for the question, Kevin. It's a good question. All right. Well, if we don't have any more, we're going to go ahead and end that now. Well, there may be something else in Q&A. Let's see.
Yeah, so we had another kind of question come up around, well, data exfiltration in the remote world, especially when you think about split tunneling or VPN or no VPN scenarios. Great point. So when you think about the scenario I ran through today, where we had some alerts on proxy activity, those alerts came because we were accessing and generating events on a corporate web proxy. But an organization that levels split tunneling, or maybe even doesn't have a VPN, where their users are just directly accessing Office 365, one of the only things that you can do is monitor those events in Office 365. And that's something that we aim to do out of the box, is be able to understand, even if a user is on a non-corporate managed machine, not connected to the VPN, how they're interacting with data in your cloud repositories, like SharePoint Online, OneDrive, or Teams, and then how that translates to even be able to identify indicators of compromise, like they're doing that from weird places or in weird ways, accessing data they don't typically access. Maybe they're sending a bunch of sharing links with other people. Often, for a lot of our customers right now, this is the only visibility they have into a large number of their employees, because they didn't have laptops for everyone, and they didn't want to just buy laptops for everyone. The path of least resistance was just giving them access to Office 365.
Great. Appreciate that, that question, Malcolm. Not seeing any more. All right. Well, like Matt said, we're available for questions after this. We'll be getting the video out so anybody can review that. If anything else comes up, you can reach out to Lauren and myself, Matt, and the Varonis team to ask those questions. Once again, Varonis, thank you very much for joining us today and giving a good presentation. Thanks for all of our customers joining. We'll call it a day. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you again. Bye-bye.